Hi, and welcome to today's edition of Severe Thunderstorm Outlooks. We have a big day today. It's been talked about for many days. You can see the graph right there with the epicenter of it, certainly over Illinois and Indiana, but a lot of states affected by this. So we have a level 2, which is the slight risk that covers a good chunk of Missouri all the way up to Rochester, Minnesota, way over into Ohio. And the moderate risk, which is the 4 out of 5 possible categories issued by the Storm Prediction Center, is up in Illinois and Indiana. We can take a closer look at some of this stuff. Here is the highest risk area, which includes Peoria, Illinois, Springfield, Illinois, Champaign, Urbana, those areas, Lafayette, Indiana, over to Indianapolis, with a large level 3 enhanced that goes right up, cuts the Chicago metro in half, goes over to Fort Wayne, almost to Toledo, St. Louis, Quincy, Columbia, in that Davenport, Quad Cities area, certainly. And if you're in the Ozarks, and I put a special graph out for on Facebook, just still images, and I probably will do a heads up weather around noon, somewhere around there, once we get the new model data in. But enhanced and slight risk down in southwest Missouri as well. So let's break this down by severe weather type. So the tornado risk is particularly high. We've only had maybe a handful of these this year, probably 4. I think maybe 3. I don't remember exactly. But when you see the red, that's a 15% chance of any tornado within a 25-mile circle of where you live. So those same areas that were under the moderate risk are basically in that zone. And then it decreases from that 10% down to 5%, down to 2% in the green. So the other thing that's on this graph are these little hatching areas here. So this is an attempt to estimate intensity. So basically, I can sum this up for you really quick. If you're in this first hatch area here, which does not necessarily correspond to the colors, but in this case it does, it's in the brown area, you basically have a 1 out of 5 chance. If you add up those percentages there, it's 20%. So 1 out of 5 chance of something EF2 or stronger, but the vast weight percentage goes to the lower intensity tornadoes. And then you go over into this hatched area here, which almost includes, well, it does include all of the moderate risk, but it leaks out a little bit. Again, it's just a matter of percent chance of a tornado, and then when it does occur, how intense it'll be. So those don't always necessarily have to match. So anyway, so this is basically a 30% chance, or about a 1 out of 3 chance of an EF2 tornado or greater. Now, let's take a look at some of the other models, see where they put this risk. NATOcast has the 10%, so not as much, but from the same general area, but extending much more to the east to include even a small chunk of Ohio. And they put the SIG tornado in that black hatching area right there. So that's an EF2 plus or greater at 10%. So, it pretty much matches everything I just showed you, except maybe it extends it a little more to the east. I also do want to point out that the tropical disturbance, I'm not sure if it was named yet or will be named. Arthur would be the name. Doesn't really matter. It's producing unstable air and a favorable wind pattern at the surface to really get the severe or the tornado risk high, actually, in the I guess you would call that the panhandle of Mississippi down there, and Biloxi right around that area. That's actually a 10% risk, so be aware of that. The tornado risk on StormNet had been looking a lot more intense, let's say 2 days ago. Yesterday it decreased. Today they were up in the 50, almost 60% range. Now, not as hot on it. We're looking about 30, maybe 35% chance in that little pocket from Champaign-Urbana to Decatur to Terre Haute, Indiana. And that timing on that is 5 to 6 p.m. tonight. So sometimes we get hourly updates, sometimes we get 12-hour updates, depending on how far away we are into the distance we're talking about. Severe wind risk is pretty high too, 45% chance of a wind gust 59 miles per hour or greater in that purple area, and a 30% chance in the red area. And then the hatching, and I finally did fix the miles per hour for folks who've been telling me to do so, and I have, and I did it, and I forgot to put it in. Anyway, so this hatching doesn't go to the next significant wind risk, but it does say that there's a really high probability, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 86% chance of it being a wind that stays below 74 miles per hour or hurricane force. But there is a little bit of a chance, about a 17% chance it will go above that mark. And if we look at the wind risk on NATOcast, they do produce that along with hail. And so we have a SIG area of a 65 knot, or in other words, hurricane force wind in that black area there, central Illinois, spreading quickly over into Indiana and Ohio today. And on the hail side, in Missouri, there's actually a 30% chance that these storms, especially around 8, 9 o'clock tonight, will be producing some pretty good hail. Basically, it's north of Springfield, does include Columbia and Jefferson City, does go back to Warsaw, and certainly over into Illinois and Indiana as well. And then NATOcast does this. They put the SIG hail, which is 2 inch or greater, 10% chance, right through central Illinois over into Indiana. And then finally, CSU's look at all this, pretty much agrees with the highest tornado risk at 15%, so up in SPC territory, right about where they put it, a little smaller, with a larger 10% risk around that. Notice they do highlight that area around Louisiana and Mississippi with a 5%, and then the wind risk is definitely higher than the hail risk. Okay, so if you're in central Illinois, I mean, it could, again, extend as far back west as central Missouri. This would be later in the afternoon, early evening, and then certainly central Illinois to central Indiana, and depending on which one you believe, ongoing over into central Ohio, or at least west central Ohio, is the main threat area today for all modes of severe weather. Then, okay, take a breath. Here's Thursday. I just wanted to include a larger image to show you all the marginal risk, which is a lot of ground. It does include the trailing end of this front, but then certainly the yellow area, the slight risk, 2 out of 5. We'll zoom in on that. So just about all of New England, except it cuts off at Maine and does extend through the nation's capital back into parts of West Virginia. It includes Richmond, Virginia. It includes New York, of course. Philly is in there. Albany, New York, Burlington, Boston area. As well, a slight risk of storms. What's the main threat with this? Well, the SPC has backed off on the tornado mention at all, really. But they do have a severe wind risk at 15%. But I'll show you some other data here to support the idea that maybe a tornado could occur up in here. But where the SPC did put the tornado risk is down in the Gulf. Again, the whatever's left of that circulation that's going to produce a lot of heavy rain, whether you want to call it Arthur or the first tropical possible storm, it doesn't really matter. It's a rain maker and possibly a tornado maker here, as you can see in this area on Thursday, tomorrow. Now, CSU does put a 5% risk of tornadoes down there from Mississippi through southern Alabama and over into Georgia, stopping just south of the Atlanta area. And then I want you to notice here in New England, there is a 2% chance of a tornado there. They do have the same wind risk as the SPC. Interestingly, the trailing end of this fund has a hail risk and a little bit of a wind risk there through southern Oklahoma and parts of Texas. On Friday, the whole thing kind of falls apart a little bit, but there's still a marginal risk in this broad area from central Mississippi to the coast in Georgia, Savannah, Georgia. And if we look at CSU's outlook, actually, they don't mention it too much over there. A little bit of a wind risk, no hail risk, too warm, too wet for that. And then the hail risk kind of ticks up there in eastern Colorado on Friday. And then finally on Saturday, this has been consistent for a couple of days now, 15% chance of any severe weather within 25 miles, covering much of Nebraska and the northern half of Kansas. And again, if we look at CSU, they actually put a 30% chance of any severe weather there in extreme western Kansas, comparing that to the SPC outlook. And I did want to show you Sunday because there is a little bit of a flare-up possible here, even though the SPC doesn't mention it. But keep it in mind that may become a target for their outlooks maybe tomorrow or the next couple of days, depending on how things go. Finally, we'll just take a look at the Supercell Index composite here over the next 7 days. Very high, as you might expect, in those areas we've talked about. So then what happens in week 2, which is the last 7 days of June, it shifts northward. So the main severe weather belt might be from South Dakota through Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, over into Michigan, including Chicago and Detroit too. And then the first 7 days of July, that same basic area, maybe creeping a little bit more to the south again. Week 3 is going to oscillate a lot more. But I will say I do this every day, and it has been pretty consistent, showing that severe weather threat this far out in that same northern region of the U.S.